Starmer's sleeve-rolling spectacle, the return to Westminster reality. Right. Before we dissect what can only be described as one of the most audacious displays of political theater Westminster has witnessed in years, make sure you hit that subscribe button. Trust me, what I'm about to reveal about Keir Starmer's post-summer strategy will fundamentally change how you view this government's credibility, and you won't want to miss a single devastating detail of this analysis. Sir Keir Starmer has returned to Westminster after what can charitably be described as a catastrophic summer break, and his response to months of plummeting poll numbers, asylum protests, and general governmental chaos has been to announce that he's rolling up his sleeves to deliver change. The sheer audacity of this positioning is breathtaking. Here's a prime minister whose administration has spent its first year in office demonstrating all the competence of a chocolate teapot, and his grand strategy for recovery is to suggest that perhaps, just perhaps, he might start trying harder. Let's be absolutely clear about what this summer has delivered for Labour. We've witnessed poll numbers that would make even the most optimistic spin doctor reach for the gin, asylum protests that have exposed the complete hollowness of the government's immigration promises, and a general sense among the British public that perhaps they made a rather significant error in judgment last election. The honeymoon period between Starmer and the voters has ended not with a gentle cooling of affections, but with a political equivalent of a restraining order. But here's where this story becomes absolutely fascinating from a political psychology perspective. Rather than acknowledging the scale of his administration's failures or demonstrating any genuine contrition for promises broken and expectations dashed, Starmer has chosen to go on the offensive. Writing in the Mirror, because apparently serious prime ministers now conduct their political warfare through tabloid columns, he has launched an extraordinary attack on both the Conservatives and Reform UK. The brass neck required for this approach is genuinely impressive in its shamelessness. We are doing the work to improve people's lives, while Reform and the Tories are constantly criticizing the nation, Starmer declared with a sort of righteous indignation that would make a Victorian preacher blush with embarrassment. The irony here is so thick you could cut it with a knife and serve it at a dinner party. This is the same Keir Starmer who spent 14 years in opposition, doing precisely nothing except criticizing the nation, the government, and anything else that moved. The same man who built his entire political career on the foundation that Britain under Conservative rule was fundamentally broken and required his personal intervention to fix. Now, having been given that opportunity to fix things, his response to legitimate criticism of his own performance is to accuse his critics of being unpatriotic. It's a kind of political projection that would fascinate a therapist and horrify anyone who believes in democratic accountability. When politicians start suggesting that criticism of their performance amounts to criticism of the nation itself, you know you're dealing with someone whose grip on both reality and constitutional principles has become somewhat tenuous. The phrase, rolling up my sleeves, has become Starmer's defining metaphor, and it reveals everything you need to know about how this government views both politics and the public. In the peculiar language of Westminster, sleeve rolling has become the universal signal for, I'm about to start taking things seriously, which immediately raises the uncomfortable question of what exactly has been doing with those sleeves for the past year. Were they perhaps being used as decorative accessories, napkins during particularly messy policy lunches, or simply kept rolled down as a mark of respect for the gravity of opposition, only to be rolled up once the real work of governance began? The challenges facing Starmer as MPs trudge back to Westminster with their summer tans fading and their political survival instinct sharpening are not merely significant, they're existential. Rachel Reeves, the Chancellor who has somehow managed to make George Osborne look economically adventurous, faces what Westminster insiders are already calling the nightmare budget this autumn. The economic fundamentals haven't magically improved during the parliamentary recess, despite what appears to be the government's fervent hope that economic reality might take a holiday alongside the politicians. Reeves will need to perform a miracle that would make the feeding of the 5,000 look like a modest catering success. She's working with an economy that's showing all the dynamism of a particularly lethargic snail, public finances that would make a Victorian workhouse administrator weep with recognition, and political promises that were apparently made in the confident expectation that mathematics might prove more flexible than traditionally assumed. The autumn budget will either demonstrate that Labour has some hidden economic genius that they've been saving for a special occasion, or it will confirm what many already suspect, that opposition economic policies tend to work much better in opposition than in government. But here is where the story becomes truly gripping. And if you're not already subscribed to UK Connors, you absolutely should be, because this analysis is about to reveal the fundamental contradictions at the heart of Labour's entire political strategy. Starmer's promise to make people feel better off and more secure runs headlong into the brutal reality of governing in an era of constrained public finances and global economic uncertainty. You cannot simultaneously promise fiscal responsibility and increased public spending, economic growth and higher taxes, national renewal and budgetary restraint. Yet this is precisely the impossible circle that Labour is attempting to square. The Nigel Farage problem looms over all of this like a particularly ominous cloud at a garden party. Reform UK has discovered something that seems to elude the entire Westminster establishment: the British public's extraordinary capacity for sustained irritation with politicians who promise transformation and deliver bureaucracy. While Starmer focuses on national renewal, whatever that might mean when translated from politician speak into human language, Farage is offering something infinitely more appealing to frustrated voters: simple solutions to complex problems and the promise to upset a political system that many perceive as fundamentally rigged against their interests. Farage's genius, if we can call it that, lies in his understanding that most people don't want competent technocratic governance. They want someone who appears to share their frustrations and promises to do something dramatic about them. Starmer, with his loyally precision, managerial approach to politics, and apparent belief that every problem can be solved through the application of sufficient process, represents everything that irritates ordinary voters about the modern political class. He is the embodiment of the establishment that Farage has built his career attacking, and no amount of sleeve rolling is going to change that fundamental dynamic. The upcoming Labour conference in late September promises to be particularly brutal for a Prime Minister whose authority within his own party has been steadily eroding along with his public approval ratings. Labour conferences are traditionally exercises in mutual congratulation and ideological reinforcement, but when poll numbers are collapsing and policies are failing, they tend to become rather more fractious affairs. Starmer will need to convince his own MPs that his leadership isn't becoming an electoral liability, while simultaneously persuading party members that his cautious, incremental approach to governance is preferable to the more radical alternatives being whispered about in conference hotel bars. The ministerial reshuffle that Starmer is reportedly considering represents another fascinating insight into how this government understands both politics and governance. The suggestion is that he might shuffle ministers but avoid touching the cabinet, which is rather like rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic while insisting that the officers must remain undisturbed. If your policies are failing and your public message isn't resonating, moving around the people responsible for implementing those policies while keeping the people responsible for designing them might not represent the most effective approach to reform. This gets to the heart of what's wrong with Starmer's entire approach to the current crisis. He appears to believe that his problems are fundamentally about presentation rather than substance, communication rather than policy, personnel rather than philosophy. The idea that he might need to fundamentally rethink his approach to governance, rather than simply finding better ways to explain his current approach, seems not to have occurred to him. It's the kind of strategic blindness that destroys political careers and governments with remarkable efficiency. Here's what makes this particularly dangerous for Labour's long-term electoral prospects, and make sure you're subscribed because this dynamic is going to dominate British politics for the foreseeable future. The party's traditional working-class base shares many of the concerns being expressed by Reform UK voters, but Labour's metropolitan leadership appears constitutionally incapable of acknowledging those concerns without being accused of betraying their progressive principles. This creates an impossible political position, where the party must choose between alienating its traditional base and disappointing its newer professional class supporters. Starmer's attack on Reform and the Conservative for constantly criticizing the nation reveals a fundamental misunderstanding of democratic politics that should concern anyone who values political accountability. In a democracy, the role of opposition parties is precisely to criticize the government when it's failing, to hold ministers accountable for their decisions, and to offer alternative approaches when current policies aren't working. Suggesting that this critical function somehow amounts to unpatriotic behavior is a kind of authoritarian thinking that has no place in British political discourse. The immigration crisis continues to expose the complete inadequacy of Labour's approach to one of the most significant challenges facing modern Britain. The asylum protests that dominated summer headlines weren't organized by extremist groups or foreign agitators. They were expressions of genuine community-level frustration by people who feel their concerns about immigration and integration are being systematically ignored by a political establishment that views their worries as evidence of prejudice rather than legitimate policy concerns. When Starmer dismisses these concerns as mere criticism of the nation, he is demonstrating exactly the kind of tone-deaf political response that drives people toward more radical alternatives. These aren't people who hate Britain. They are people who love Britain enough to be concerned about what they perceive as threats to the communities they spent their lives building. Treating their concerns as illegitimate or unpatriotic is precisely the kind of political arrogance that created the space for Brexit, for Trump, for Farage, and for every other populist movement that has disrupted established political orders across the Western world. The economic promises embedded in Starmer's sleeve-rolling rhetoric deserve particular scrutiny because they reveal just how disconnected this government has become from fiscal reality. His claims about constructing new homes throughout the nation and improving transportation infrastructure sound impressive until you examine the actual numbers. House building remains well below the levels needed to address Britain's housing crisis, while transport infrastructure projects continue to suffer from the kind of cost overruns and delivery delays that have become synonymous with British public sector management. The promise to provide new technology, skills training, and well-paid, good jobs represents a kind of aspirational politics that sounds wonderful in speeches but means absolutely nothing in practice. Every government since the Second World War has promised to create well-paid jobs and improve skills training. The question isn't whether these are desirable outcomes. Of course they are, but whether this particular government has any credible plan for achieving them beyond the traditional Labour approach of spending other people's money and hoping for the best. Here's where Starmer's rhetoric about national renewal becomes particularly problematic. And if you're not already subscribed, you should be, because this analysis is going to become increasingly relevant as the scale of Labour's promises becomes clear. National renewal isn't something that can be achieved through government programs, ministerial announcements, or even increased public spending. It requires a fundamental transformation in how Britain approaches education, innovation, entrepreneurship, and economic development. It requires a kind of long-term strategic thinking that transcends electoral cycles and partisan politics. Yet everything about Starmer's approach suggests that he views national renewal as essentially a marketing exercise, a way of rebranding traditional Labour policies to make them sound more ambitious and transformative than they actually are. The gap between the rhetoric of transformation and the reality of incremental policy adjustments is becoming so vast that even sympathetic observers are starting to notice the disconnect. The international dimension of Britain's challenges adds another layer of complexity that Starmer's domestic focus seems to ignore entirely. Global supply chain disruptions, international economic uncertainty, geopolitical tensions, and technological disruption are all reshaping the environment in which British governments must operate. You cannot achieve national renewal while ignoring the international forces that increasingly determine domestic outcomes. Starmer's apparent belief that Britain's problems can be solved through better domestic management reveals a kind of parochial thinking that's completely inadequate for governing a modern, interconnected economy. The challenges facing Britain, from productivity growth to housing costs to immigration pressures, are largely international phenomena that require international solutions. Rolling up your sleeves and promising to work harder might be politically satisfying, but it's not a substitute for genuine strategic thinking about Britain's place in the world. The polling evidence that's driving Starmer's apparent panic reveals just how quickly political fortunes can change in contemporary British politics. Labour's honeymoon period has ended not gradually, but with dramatic suddenness, suggesting that public confidence in this government was always more fragile than the electoral victory suggested. When voters lose faith in a government's competence, that confidence is extraordinarily difficult to rebuild, particularly when the underlying policy failures continue to mount. Reform UK's rise in the polls represents more than just a temporary protest vote against Labour's early failures. It represents a fundamental realignment in British politics that neither Labour nor the Conservatives seem to understand or know how to address. Farage has identified a constituency of voters who feel that the entire political establishment has failed them and is offering them something that mainstream parties cannot provide: the promise to blow up a system that they perceive as working against their interests. This is where Starmer's sleeve-rolling metaphor becomes particularly hollow. The problems facing Britain are the result of politicians not working hard enough or not caring sufficiently about the public good. They are the result of structural challenges that require fundamental changes in how we approach governance, economic policy, and social organization. Working harder within a failed system doesn't solve systemic problems. It just produces more elaborate failures. The autumn budget that Rachel Reeves will deliver represents the first real test of whether Labour's economic policies can survive contact with fiscal reality. The pre-election promises about economic growth, increased public investment, and improved living standards all seemed plausible when they were competing with conservative economic management that had produced inflation, stagnation, and political chaos. But now Labour must demonstrate that their alternatives actually work better, not just sound better. The early signs are not encouraging. Public sector productivity remains stubbornly low. Private sector investment is still constrained by regulatory uncertainty and high costs, and the international economic environment continues to present challenges that domestic policy cannot address. Reeves will need to perform economic alchemy to deliver the growth needed to fund Labour's spending commitments without imposing the kind of tax increases that would choke off the very growth she needs to generate. Starmer's promise that his government will make every citizen feel better off and more secure represents a kind of political overreach that destroys administrations when reality fails to match rhetoric. Feelings of economic security and prosperity depend on factors largely beyond any government's control: global economic conditions, technological change, demographic pressures, and international competition. Promising to control outcomes that you cannot actually control is a political equivalent of writing checks that you know will bounce. The tragedy for Labour is that they created expectations they cannot possibly meet with the resources and political capital available to them. Opposition politics rewards ambitious promises and sweeping critiques of the status quo, but governing requires a kind of incremental progress and uncomfortable trade-offs that rarely satisfy anyone completely. The gap between campaign rhetoric and governmental reality is becoming so obvious that even sympathetic media coverage cannot disguise the fundamental disconnect. As MPs return to Westminster and Starmer rolls up his sleeves for what promises to be the most challenging period of his political career, one thing is abundantly clear: the easy part of his journey is definitively over. From now on, he'll be judged not on his promises or his intentions, but on his results. And based on current evidence, those results are likely to fall considerably short of the national renewal he's promised to deliver. Subscribe to UK Connors to stay ahead of every twist and turn in this unfolding political drama, because whether Starmer is rolling up his sleeves or simply rolling over, the consequences will reshape British politics for years to come. The autumn session promises to be absolutely crucial, and you won't want to miss how this story develops.